Hey people, before we start, I'd like to apologize for not having anything else out over the last year or so. I've actually been working on several videos that got through the majority of the writing, editing, recording process before I realized they weren't gonna work. So those are just on my hard drive now. I may do something with them later, but probably not. Anyways, on with the video. Hey people, it's ScionVyse here. I'm a big fan of Metroidvania games. They're arguably my favorite genre of game right now. From the old classics to the new hits, there's always something I can enjoy about them. So, it's no surprise that I'm a big fan of Hollow Knight. Yeah. When I first got it in 2017 though, I really did not like it. So, let's explore why, and why I changed my mind. Before we go into my personal experience with Hollow Knight, we need to know what Hollow Knight actually is. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania game where you play as the Knight, a little bug dude swinging around a nail as you travel across the kingdom of Hallownest to save it from some infection that threatens to destroy everything. The overall story of the world isn't directly told to the player for the most part, relying on environmental details and lore tablets to really flesh out the world. I really like this sort of storytelling. It takes advantage of video games as a medium more than any cinematic cutscene fest or huge dialogue dump ever could. With that in mind, it's hard to fully explain the story and world in a small, compressed form. I'm sure there are loads of lore videos here on YouTube you can check out if you want to know the details of Hollow Knight's story. Right from the get-go, it's pretty striking in its visuals. Everything is beautifully drawn and animated, and it's done in a way that really sets itself apart in the genre. Characters, enemies, and bosses all have really cool and unique designs, and the visual design overall sets a really good atmosphere for the game. This is something that's actually evolved quite a bit from the game's original release, with different effects and such being added and changed with its main content updates. For the record, I'm going to be using the most recent update, Godmaster, for this video. Overall, it's really well polished, and while there are a few bugs, overall it looks and sounds great. Aside from some areas looking more like palette swaps than unique places, there really isn't much to complain about. The only issue I have with the presentation is that some of the audio isn't implemented properly. Have a listen to this clip here. As you can hear, the sound of the wall breaking is significantly louder than anything else, because I have dropped the master volume down a bit, and the sound isn't properly bussed to that mixer. So, it stays at max volume. If you keep all the levels at max though, you shouldn't even really notice this at all. In terms of gameplay, it's a pretty standard fare in the broad strokes. It's a 2D platformer, and you eventually get all the genre's staple movement abilities like a wall jump, a side dash, and a shine spark. You collect abilities and upgrades to your HP and magic, and you can also augment the Knight's abilities with charms that you can find around the world. This should all seem familiar if you've played other Metroidvanias, but its focus, however, is the combat. Combat is very simple in Hollow Knight, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. You press a button to swing your nail, and you can swing it in 4 different directions: left, right, up, and down when you're in the air. There's also magic abilities which you can get to give you some more options. For example, you can get a Howling Shriek for an overhead blast, or the Vengeful Spirit as a long-range missile. The soul you gain from attacking enemies has other uses, with its main defensive function being healing. Your base soul meter at full is effectively 3 masks worth of healing, but you can't just gain health back freely. The Knight has to charge up his soul into a mask, and this takes time. If you're hit while charging up that health, not only do you not heal, but the soul you were using is gone as well. This makes healing a risk versus reward system, and I quite like how it's handled. Overall, while the system is simple, its simplicity works in its favor. Everything is completely under the player's control, and that control can give you access to a lot of options. It's not all great though, at least in my opinion. I really dislike how hitting enemies knocks the Knight back. Not to get all game analysis-y here, but knockback is generally a punishment for getting hit or coming into contact with something you shouldn't. So in that sense, it just feels like the game is punishing the player for doing what the game basically forces you to do, which is fight a lot of enemies. Thankfully, there is a charm that negates all knockback, and I always grab that as soon as I can. Another staple of the genre are bosses, which Hollow Knight has in droves. The bosses really test your skill, and while a few of them aren't that great, they're generally fantastic and one of my favorite things in Hollow Knight. The designs are almost always really interesting, and the team did a great job of not only making them difficult and fair, but every boss arena is wonderfully atmospheric, which really adds to the experience of fighting them. Just to get this out of the way, my 5 favorite bosses are Paintmaster Sheo, Nightmare King Grim, Pure Vessel, Lost Kin, and Sisters of Battle. If you fall to one of these bosses or die in general, you'll leave behind what's called a shade. A shade is a creature that spawns when you die, and it holds on to a third of your primary soul meter and all of the money you've collected until you dispatch it, which is a pretty common thing in games nowadays. In true Dark Souls fashion as well, if you die again before reaching the shade, all the money it was holding will be gone. Hollow Knight's world is set up like most other Metroidvanias as well, with a huge sprawling map full of areas that can't be accessed until getting new abilities, full of interconnectivity that really rewards exploration over just following the intended path. It really shows how much the team loves the genre, as the map alone feels like a big love letter. For instance, after getting the dash from Hornet in Green Path, the game intends for you to head down into the Fungal Wastes, where you're intended to die to the Mantis Lords. Then you're intended to go to the City of Tears to get some upgrades that will help you beat them, as well as prepare you for some other areas. However, this requires you beat the False Knight in Forgotten Crossroads, since it has the crest required to open the city's gates. One thing I like to do is skip the False Knight entirely, and once I beat the Mantis Lords with base equipment, I enter Deep Nest, grab the tram ticket, and head down to the Deep Nest tram to get access to Kingdom's Edge, which has an entrance to the City of Tears. Sure, it's a bit of a detour, but it lets you skip an early game boss that your average player will never know is optional. This route also opens up the Ancient Basin early, where you can get what is usually the last movement option, the double jump, well before some others. Outside of the main adventure, there are a few other things you can do in Hollow Knight that are totally optional. You can travel around the world and find hidden grubs that have been put in jars and free them. You can go fight in the arenas, which really test your skills in the combat, and you can go back and fight special dream versions of certain bosses. On top of that, there are even more optional bosses and platforming areas that exist to really test your mettle, but most of these do count towards your completion percentage, so if you want to get that coveted 112%, you'd better get exploring. While the game being incredibly open and filled with optional content is great for replay value, challenge runs, etc., that openness did lead to a bit of a strange difficulty curve that probably wouldn't happen if the game had been designed with a more specific progression map. However, the biggest casualty of this openness is the final boss, the Hollow Knight. This is, for many people, the final boss of the game, but since it's possible to fight him fairly early without needing to scour the map for optional content, they couldn't go all out with him as a final encounter. This leads the Hollow Knight to be a fairly dull and disappointing boss, as he can go down very easily, even with very few mask, soul, and nail upgrades. Of course, the Hollow Knight isn't the true final boss, and the Radiance is a much more challenging, climactic bout, but it would have been nice if the team were able to scale up the Hollow Knight's difficulty a bit depending on completion or world progression or something. The mapping system is pretty unique as well. You don't just fill in a map as you go along, you need quite a few things in order to have a fully functional map. You need to 1. Buy the map, 2. Buy the quill so you can fill in areas that the map doesn't have, and 3. You need a charm in order to see where you are on the map. Now, I understand the idea behind this, I just don't feel like it works as well as intended. Like, I feel the people who need the map and compass the most are going to need the extra resources and charm slot the most as well. It's great on multiple playthroughs when you know your way around and don't need to use up the extra money or charm slot on the mapping, but it can be a big drain on initial runs of the game. Not to lay on the negatives too quickly here, but the scale and openness of the map can lead to some pretty wonky pacing near the early mid-game as well. The first few areas are pretty straightforward. You have to go through them in a pretty specific way in order to get basic movement upgrades you need to access the rest of the map. Once you do though, the game really gives no instruction as to what you should be doing. It just gives you a big map and expects you to go exploring. Then, depending on where you find yourself going, you could go hours without finding a single new upgrade or ability, or you could grab a bunch of them all in one go. On subsequent playthroughs, I loved this, since it gave me a bunch of ways to progress through the game without forcing a specific path. However, on my first playthrough, this was a big point of contention. I, through my exploration, found myself in some rather late game areas basically a few hours after I started, and the way the game's saving system worked, I managed to get myself trapped. So there I was, trying to enjoy the game, but I'm stuck in an area that I'm really not prepared for with basically no way out. And I hated it. Deep Nest, by the way. So at that point I quit the game. I tried again 2 other times and quit as well. On the 4th attempt, however, right after the Lifeblood update, I feel like something just clicked. Maybe it was due to me knowing the early game well enough that it wasn't daunting anymore. Maybe it was the no knockback charm that I found for the first time. Maybe it was the small improvements that Team Cherry had made to the game throughout the 3 updates, but it just clicked. And it clicked hard. Over the next few weeks I did almost nothing but play Hollow Knight. I got a 100% completed file in just under 20 hours. Then I got the speedrun achievements. Then I got 107% via the DLC content. Then I did Steel Soul mode. Then I 100%ed Steel Soul mode. And just to remind you, I did all of this over the course of like 2 weeks. I can't really remember the last time I got so thoroughly invested in a game. It all just fit together right. My complaints didn't go away, the knockback from attacking is still bad, and I'm still not a huge fan of the mapping system, but I just didn't really care. It's a lot like Super Metroid for me in that sense. I'm not comparing the quality of the 2 games, but for a long time I couldn't get into Super Metroid over the later games. The jumping was wonky and it just didn't feel right. But for one day it just clicked and my complaints stopped mattering. I know it seems like a bit of an anticlimax considering how I started the video, but that's exactly what happened. I kind of had the worst case scenario for a first playthrough and basically didn't start having fun until I knew my way around the early game. My fault, of course, by trying to bite off more than I could chew. So there's 2 more things I want to talk about here, 1 positive, 1 negative, and going with the tried and true angry reviewer style here, we're going to end on a low note, so let's talk about the game's music. The music was composed by Christopher Larkin, and there really isn't a whole lot to say about the soundtrack that wouldn't just evolve into, oh my god, it's so good. It's beautifully composed, focusing on a string orchestra with some other instruments and percussion for flair. It fits the game perfectly, and I'm really jealous because I wish I could write music even half as good as this. And that's not even mentioning the production and mixing quality of it. Everything was performed perfectly, and the mixing is so well done that it all sounds perfectly balanced, with nothing being masked. Every instrument in every track is clear, and really the whole thing is just a joy to listen to. Just for reference, my favorite track is the Mantis Lord's battle theme. It's just amazing. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the game's DLC. Since the game's launch, there have been 4 free content updates, all of which have significantly changed parts of Hollow Knight. All of these have added a lot of content to the main game, either bringing new areas, new bosses, new NPCs, or in the case of Lifeblood, a significant presentation overhaul to many aspects of the game. Overall, these have been very good. The Grim Troop added some of the best content the game has to offer with its bosses, NPCs, and charms. Lifeblood changed the game in general for the better, and while Hidden Dreams is the smallest update, what it added was quite nice as well. Now with that out of the way, we're going to discuss the newest and last free content update for Hollow Knight, Godmaster. Godmaster was released a few months ago, and I feel like it's safe to say that it's fairly divisive. Basically, what it is a boss rush DLC. The team created a new area for it, and there's really a bunch of stuff here, but I just can't bring myself to like it. If there's one way I could describe it, it's that Godmaster is the first real, actual game design fault the team made, and doing so made the whole DLC a disappointment. It's set up like this. There are 5 boss rushes, called Pantheons, available in the new area Godhome for the player to beat. Beating one unlocks the next one until you unlock the final Pantheon. Each one contains a set of bosses from the main game, with at least one new boss waiting for you at the end as a final challenge. This sounds fine. The problem here is the balancing of each Pantheon. The first two are fine, with a decent challenge and a good boss waiting at the end. Then the third comes along, it's just horribly balanced. There's a string of really hard bosses one after the other, one of which is a redesigned version of a main game boss, which gives the player no time to recover from, and it just became a huge sticking point for many players. The fourth, while containing some harder bosses overall, I feel is just better paced and more fair. Then there's the final Pantheon. Each one up until now has been like 10 bosses each, so even if you fail, it's not too bad to start again. The Pantheon of Hallownest is a whole other beast. It's every boss of every previous Pantheon, with harder versions of some, like the Mantis Lords being replaced with the Sisters of Battle, and if you lose, you start all over again. Overall, there's 42 bosses in a row that you have to beat on one life, and at the end there's a redone version of the game's true final boss, the Radiance, which has been overtuned so hard that winning is essentially based on RNG. Even all that wouldn't be that bad if the new mode they added was okay, but nope. Once you have unlocked God Home and beaten the first 3 Pantheons, you unlock the new Godseeker mode, which is just God Home without the rest of the game, and all the bosses except for Absolute Radiance are available to fight right from the beginning. It's just disappointing. I feel like there's a lot of cool stuff here, but keeping a lot of this cool stuff in limbo is just lame. You know what I would have loved? Imagine after beating the 3rd Pantheon, you unlock a new Game Plus mode where everything is the same, except all of the boss fights are replaced with their Godmaster counterparts. That would have added some extra challenge to the game while giving the player the ability to experience all the boss fights in their proper context. It would also give the player more options, since they'd be able to go with like low mask runs or only charm runs or that sort of thing that Godseeker doesn't really allow, because it gives you max everything right from the start. But as it is, I just don't see much point to it. Fighting the bosses again is nice, but the actual boss rush mode is something I don't see myself completing. The Pantheon of Hallownest isn't worth the effort, and that's just made worse because there's a new ending locked behind it. Sorry to end on such a low note, but I feel like Godmaster leaves a bad taste in my mouth after how amazing I feel the rest of the game is. Now even with that, I 100% recommend Hollow Knight to anyone who loves the Metroidvania genre. It is such a fantastic game, and it's a game I'll be pointing to in the future as like a prime example of the best the genre has to offer. I can't wait to see what Team Cherry does next with their next project, which happens to be releasing this year actually, Hollow Knight Silksong. This used to be a DLC for Hollow Knight that kind of expanded into its own game. I hope to cover it later in the year when it releases, and I hope I don't take another year to actually do that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much. Later. Just some post-production thoughts here. I'm still kind of experimenting with what direction I want to take my videos in. This one was a little bit less jokey than the last one. I'm still kind of debating what sort of balance I want to do with that. I'll figure it out though. Hope you enjoyed it anyways. Not sure what my next video will be on, but I should start working on it soon, and hopefully it will be done before next year. Anyways, thanks again for watching. See you later.